He reaches out His hand of grace to lift us up from whatever may be paralyzing our lives, so that we can walk and jump and dance in newness of life before Him.
Perhaps it happens in the frustration of failure, or in the loneliness of despair, or in the struggle to simply survive. But sooner or later, in the darkness of the night, the question arises within us: what am I doing here? It doesn't matter whether you're a student on the verge of flunking out of school, or a teacher wondering how you'll handle all the students under your care, or an employee floundering under the overwhelming demands of your job, or a spouse fighting to save your marriage. That sense of inadequacy permeates our doubts and fuels our fears. We live in a world today where it is no longer assumed that children will do better than their parents. Social Security is projected to go bankrupt in our lifetimes. Global warming is disrupting the ecology of the earth. Political, racial, and social tensions are erupting in violence. And this deadly global pandemic we're in not only threatens our lives, but the freedoms that we once took for granted. Today, more than ever before, people are desperate for answers. Can we, as a church, adequately address the hopelessness and fear in people around us? Are we, as Christians, capable and willing to be beacons of light and hope in the darkness of this world? But Pastor, you say, I'm struggling with my own inadequacy and sense of insecurity. Well, if that's your answer, friend, then perhaps this story is for you. One day, Jesus' disciples were gathered around him after being out in the world ministering in his name. They were busy men. The Bible tells us that they were so focused on their mission that they sometimes didn't even take time to eat. Jesus noticed this. And so he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." Oh, how I love Jesus. Because he doesn't push me to produce more. He doesn't stress me out by saying, work harder. Instead, he invites me to rest. That's why he gave us the Sabbath, so that we could rest from our labors. That's why he invites us to come to him, because he wants to give us rest. You see, friends, the reason that we sometimes get so tired along our Christian walk is not because Jesus is a slave driver, but rather because we refuse his invitation to come to him and to rest.
But even as Jesus invited his disciples to come away with him and rest, the needs of the people around them pressed in. And somehow word got out as to where they were going. And so when they finally arrived at their anticipated resting place, the disciples were dismayed to discover a crowd of about 5,000 men and an uncounted number of women and children already there waiting for them. Have you ever been harassed by someone who kept following you around? If you have, then you understand how stressful that can be. But Jesus didn't just have to deal with one stalker. He had to address a crowd of people who followed him obsessively from place to place to place, waiting like hungry vultures for his next miracle. But instead of being irritated, instead of being bothered by their presence, the Bible says that Jesus had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Sheep without a shepherd wander aimlessly, flirting with danger, unaware of poisonous snakes hiding in the grass, oblivious to hungry wolves lurking in the shadows. The prophet Isaiah described sinners in this way when he wrote, "All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way." And we're not the only ones. It's other people as well. Have you been irritated by children who didn't know how to behave in church? Have you been bothered by people who don't keep the Sabbath properly? It's easy for us to condemn those who don't live up to the standards, the truths that we believe in. But that's not what Jesus did. Instead of condemning wayward sinners, Jesus had compassion on them. That's the essence of God's grace. Friends, this is the example that Jesus has set for us to follow. Instead of condemning others, we are called to have compassion on them as we seek to reflect the character of Christ. And so Jesus began teaching the people many things. But as the day wore on, the people began to get hungry. And because it was such a remote place, there wasn't a nearby store for them to go and buy something to eat. That was a problem that the disciples didn't want. And so they came to Jesus and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the nearby farms and villages and buy something to eat." Have you ever talked to Jesus that way? In other words, when faced with an overwhelming problem that you can't solve, have you ever tried to tell him what to do? Send the people away so they can buy something to eat. Lord, please make so-and-so do this. Lord, please do that. As if we knew what was best. That's what the disciples were doing with Jesus. But notice how he responded. Instead of going along with their limited human logic, Jesus said to them, "You feed them." How would you have felt if you were one of Jesus' disciples that day? What would you have done to feed 5,000 men and an uncounted number of women and children? Cynthia Prime can tell you, because that's what Jesus said to her when she looked at the plight of orphans in Swaziland. Even as she prayed for God to address their needs, she heard Jesus saying to her, "You feed them." And so, giving up her career in corporate America, she, together with her friend Linda Schultz, for the past 15 years, have been serving orphans in Swaziland in obedience to God's call. I know, because I've seen many of these orphans fed and clothed and educated through their sacrifice and the sacrifice of some of you here today. But the task is too great for Cynthia and Linda to accomplish in their own strength. And while their faith in God is amazing, I know that Cynthia struggles with her own sense of inadequacy, because she often asks for my prayers. Perhaps that's how you feel, friend, as you struggle with God's call in your life. What am I doing here, you cry? I don't have the talent. I don't have the skill. I don't have the wisdom. I don't have the experience. I don't have the resources to answer your call. And we're tempted to run away and hide. How often have we been tempted to look at the negatives instead of building on the positives? As the disciples considered the overwhelming task of feeding 5,000 men and an uncounted number of women and children, they decided that it was impossible. And so they came to Jesus and asked him just to send them away. How often have we been tempted to do the same thing? But instead of allowing his disciples to dwell on the negatives, instead of going along with their limited human logic, Jesus asked them, "How much bread do you have? And when they couldn't answer him, he said, go and find out. You see, the first thing that Jesus told his disciples to do in the face of his overwhelming command to feed 5,000 men was to take stock of what they already had. Or perhaps I should say, what he had already given them. It reminds me of that time when the disciples came to Jesus, saying, Lord, increase our faith. Implying that they didn't have enough. And Jesus said to them, in so many words, you have enough faith. If you have the faith of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. You see, Jesus says you have what you need. He knew what he had already given. And so, in essence, he was asking them, what is in your hand? This is the answer that Jesus asks you and me. Even as we face the overwhelming call that he has placed upon our lives. But Mark wasn't the only one to record this story. John the Beloved gave us even more detail in his gospel. You see, Mark says that the disciples canvassed the crowd and came back with 5 loaves and 2 fish. But John tells us where those loaves and fish came from. They came from a youth. It was Andrew who brought the youth to Jesus' attention, saying, there's a young boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that with this huge crowd? How often have we made the mistake of discounting what young people have to offer? And young people sometimes feel the same. When God called Jeremiah to be his prophet, he was still a young man. And he said to God, he said, "O sovereign Lord, I can't speak for you. I'm too young." But God refused to accept that answer. Instead, he replied, "Don't say, 'I'm too young.' For you must go wherever I send you and say whatever I tell you." You see, friends, it's not about you. It's all about God. He is the one who sends you. He is the one who tells you what to say. You see, age is not a factor with a God who has no beginning or end. From the perspective of eternity, it doesn't matter how young you are, or for that matter, how old you may be. God can use you to make a difference for his kingdom. But not only is age a non-factor with God, so too is the size of the offering that we bring him. Can you imagine how reluctant Andrew must have been to present 5 loaves and 2 fish to Jesus in the face of this overwhelming challenge, this overwhelming command that he had been given to feed 5,000 men and an uncounted number of women? His friend Philip put it best when he said to Jesus, even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough money to feed them. That's human logic. Perhaps if it was you or me, we would have decided not to insult Jesus by presenting him with such a meager offering. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever said to Jesus, Lord, I don't have anything to give you. My offering is too small. My offering is too insignificant to make a difference. I've got nothing, Lord, to give you. But Jesus doesn't scorn what is in our hand because he put it there. And no matter how small, no matter how insignificant you may think it is, that's all he needs to work a miracle in your life for his glory and honor. God asked Moses what was in his hand. And Moses said, a rod. That's all it is, God. Just a simple rod. And God used that rod to part the Red Sea and to save the Israelites from their enemies. God asked a young David what was in his hand, and David replied, a stone. And God used that stone to slay the giant who was defying the armies of the living God. God asked a young boy what was in his hand, and he replied, a lunch. And God used that little lunch to feed more people than that boy ever dreamed possible. And when all was said and done, 5,000 men and an uncounted number of women and children were fed. And 12 baskets of food were left over. One for every disciple of Jesus. You see, friends, when we step out in faith and obedience to God's call to feed others, he feeds us even more. But when God calls us, he calls us to do things that we can't accomplish in our own strength, in our own power. That's what I tell people when they ask me, how do I know it's a call from God? I ask them, is it impossible for you? God calls us to do things that are impossible for us to accomplish in our own strength. That's why he calls us to be perfect. because we can't be on our own. That's why he calls us to be holy and righteous, because it's beyond our ability to accomplish. But when we see our need for him, when we place our faith and trust in him, he takes what little we may have in our hands and works a miracle in our lives for his glory and for the benefit of others. Friend, that's what Jesus wants to do with you, if you will answer his call. And so the next time that you see a crowd of people who are hungry, whether physically or spiritually or socially or emotionally or otherwise, pay close attention. Because if you listen carefully, you just might hear Jesus saying to you, "You feed them."